It's Friday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster.
This was a disgrace. This was a rigged trial by a conflicted judge who was corrupt.
Donald Trump becomes the first former or serving president to be convicted of a crime. Andrew Neil joins us live from New York to digest what it all means. Also today, back on the campaign trail, but Keir Starmer is still facing accusations he's trying to oust left-wing candidates. This former Labour MP speaks to us exclusively about his suspension by the party following a complaint.
What's happened is I've been a sacrificial lamb. It is one system if you are very at the top or in the clique, and it is another system if you're not.
And we hear from the SNP as Scotland's First Minister campaigns in Glasgow. Joining us today, Conservative Cabinet Minister Mel Stride, Labour's Meg Hillier, political consultant and former Conservative advisor Jo Tanner, and Bloomberg's Alva Ray. This is Politics Live Election 2024. Well, let's start with the big news overnight that Donald Trump has become the first president in American history to be convicted of a crime. Let's take a look at some of the front pages. The Times. Trump found guilty in hush money trial. There are pictures of him in the New York court where he was tried and found guilty on all counts of falsifying business records. The Daily Telegraph. Trump guilty with his eyes closed there. Let's have a look at another front page. Here, the New York Times, just one word, guilty. Jury convicts Trump on all 34 counts. And finally, a different take in the New York Post. Injustice. NYC jury makes Donald Trump first felon president after political hit job. Let's get your reaction when you heard the news. Alva.
Absolutely extraordinary, isn't it? And guilty of all charges. I mean, my Bloomberg colleagues in the States have been covering this closely. I think now we just need to see what happens, what kind of sentence he gets, whether he will actually be sent to prison, and then I think it looks likely that he will appeal, so this will drag on a bit.
What was your reaction last night?
The first one came in and I was kind of like, oh my gosh, this is just going to derail everything, because you could sort of preempt what he was going to say. And this kind of, you know, I'm going to attack everybody else. It still isn't me, even though this jury has returned the verdict. So, and also some interesting, I'm sort of intrigued as to how it's going to play out here, because there's some big questions for the leaders that are going to be asked about how they're going to deal with a former president who then might be elected. You know, it's going to make for an interesting next few months.
Oh, it certainly will. Meg, what did you think when you first saw the news?
Well, I saw the news of all 34, and that was the first time I picked up the headline, and I was really shocked, because it's sort of it's quite a reeling thing, isn't it, that someone who was the leader of the free world, or as they like to describe themselves, the president of the United States, has had this conviction. But I think there is a really, big challenges ahead. It's not going to be quick because of an appeal, so it could butt up right against the Republican selection and the actual US election.
Right, and welcome to you for the second time this week, Mel Stride. Are they only letting you out at Conservative headquarters?
No, I'm here by popular demand.
Oh, of course, of course.
Do you remember Mary Lloyd, before your time, many years ago, who was there by demand of the public?
You're very welcome, and we're very pleased to have you here twice in 1 week. And your response to the other big...
Well, as with everybody else here, I think just an extraordinary moment in US history. Not entirely unprecedented, in as much as I believe there was a communist that ran for the presidency of the United States about 100 years ago and did it from prison. But other than that, I'm not going to say anything at all, because as a UK Cabinet Minister, we keep right out of US elections, and I don't want to say anything one way or another about that, other than it's the American people that will decide on the 5th of November.
Well, let's go to New York and speak to someone very familiar to the programme and to me, and a veteran follower of US politics, Andrew Neil. Hello to you, Andrew. You're in the city that made Donald Trump and has now convicted him. I mean, we're in uncharted territory, aren't we?
Yes, he is the first ever former president to be convicted of a crime. That hasn't happened before. It will, of course, be appealed, but the appeal will not be resolved this side of November. So in other words, we go into the election with this hanging over him. Mr. Biden and his people will say, do you want a convicted felon as your president? Doesn't this confirm our view that he's never fit to be in the White House in the first place? He's unfit for any public office, never mind the highest. Mr. Trump's people will say, I'm a political prisoner. I'm the victim of a political witch hunt. They couldn't beat me at the ballot box, so they fixed the courts, the Democratic judge, a Democratic jury, a Democratic district attorney to stop me from becoming president.
Yes.
And the verdict on that, the people on November the 5th will have to decide which version of events they choose before they vote.
I mean, Andrew, a lot of people will want to know, will Donald Trump go to jail?
Well, we don't know. That sentencing isn't until the 11th of July, which interestingly is 3 days before the Republican convention in Milwaukee, where Mr. Trump will be crowned official Republican presidential candidate for 2024. It's a white-collar crime. He's a first offender on these things. It's unusual for jail time to be given, even if he is given jail time by the judge, and the Republicans say he might because he's an anti-Trump judge, they claim. He won't actually go to jail because the appeal process will stop that from happening. Of course, there is nothing in the US Constitution to stop somebody from running for presidency,
yes,
either as a convicted felon or from jail.
Yes.
Indeed, Mel Stride is right. He wasn't quite a communist. He was an anti-World War I, anti-conscription guy that Woodrow Wilson threw in jail. And in 1920, I should say, 1920, the year Warren Harding won, he ran from the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary for president and got over 1 million votes.
Right.
I remember interviewing him at the time, and he was quite an interesting character.
Yes, I can imagine he was. I mean, it does seem incredible to many people that none of this would prevent him running, Donald Trump, for president. You outlined the sort of campaign pitches, if you like, but what will the impact be on voters in the United States who are not natural Trump supporters but might have been considering voting for him if he were running?
Well, first of all, this has further divided an already highly polarized country. This has confirmed everything the Biden base didn't like and hated about Trump, and confirmed everything the Trump base thinks about the system being stacked against them. Mr. Biden and Mr. Trump have a visceral hatred of each other. I think it will fire up Mr. Trump more because the Biden campaign, I speak to a lot of people in the Democratic National Committee, the Biden campaign is kind of tottering at the moment. It's not going too well. He is visibly aging in front of us, whereas Trump will probably get a new lease of life. But the issue is not the core on either side. What turnout will be important is how is this going to go down among centrists, moderates, and independents, particularly suburban women. And in some ways now, how this is interpreted in the suburbs, and as they call them in America, the exurbs, those bits further out from the city centre, how this is interpreted in Detroit, Milwaukee, and Philadelphia will determine the outcome of the 2024 presidential election.
I mean, Andrew, whatever happens, there is the very real prospect that whoever wins the general election here in the UK could well be dealing with a convicted felon. What strains or difficulties will that bring to the UK's relationship, if any, with the US?
Well, I mean, some politicians in Britain have already tied themselves in knots over Donald Trump. I mean, he is a difficult candidate to know how to deal with. I think Mr. David Lammy, the Shadow Foreign Secretary, at one stage was referring to Mr. Trump as a Nazi. Though in the past month, Mr. Lammy has been reaching out to Trump people. I know them and have spoken to them, and he's met them. So, you know, gone from Nazi to, can I meet you? Look, at the end of the day, who the American people choose as their president, convicted felon or not, is the person that a British Prime Minister will have to deal with, whether we like it or not. We live in the world of realpolitik. Whoever runs America does not take away from the fact it is by far our most important ally. The worry I have at the moment, when you have a visibly ailing president and a convicted felon now as his main opponent, is that this is a good day for President Putin in Moscow and President Xi in Beijing. And an age when the autocrats are on the march and successful.
Yes.
Once again, Western leadership is in the dirt and not up to the challenges the democracies face.
Andrew Neil there in New York. You've got an exciting few months ahead. Let's put it like that. Great to talk to you.
Sure.
Let's pick up on that. Yes, David Lammy, Shadow Foreign Secretary, maybe becoming the Foreign Secretary. He's changed his tone, hasn't he? A bit of realpolitik then, perhaps.
Well, I think, Andrew's absolutely right. Whoever a country elects, you have to deal with the elected leader. And frankly, we're dealing with leaders of countries that aren't elected, let's be honest. That's the reality.
Yeah, but this, of course, is a close outline.
Yes, this is and I think that you have to deal with what you've got. We're due to have a new ambassador in Washington as well, around just after. I think they'll be taking over with January when the new president, whoever that is elected. So, that there will have to be an engagement, and of course any government will engage, including Keir Starmer, if he's elected as Prime Minister, with whoever is the President of the United States.
Whoever wins the election, what will be going through their minds, do you think, Rishi Sunak or Keir Starmer in that first visit, if it is Donald Trump?
I think that probably common interests trump personalities, actually. So I think the fact that there are so many threats in the world, from a rising China and issues between Russia and Ukraine and so on and so forth, means that actually we have a commonality of interest that will bind us together, as has traditionally been the case over many decades. And I would expect that to be what will win through, whatever may have been said about whoever prior to that point.
Right. Do you think people are already sort of thinking about the consequences of what could happen in November? It's interesting. The snap election, of course, has meant we're not rubbing up right against US politics in that sense.
Yeah. Well, I think all parties that are serious about getting into government, and all governments obviously look ahead, and they're gaming what the various eventualities might be and how they may be in the best position to do that. And of course, we have a fantastic Foreign Service that's very good at doing exactly that. So certainly that will be going.
They might be all leaving in droves now, though, worried about what's coming around the corner.
Well.
Doesn't feel like the diplomatic service is going to be an area you're going to want to go into, given so much happening.
Or you may be called on for more diplomacy than ever before, Alva.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's looking very likely that it will be David Lammy as Foreign Secretary in a few weeks, and you can see already that this will be difficult for parts of the Labour Party to swallow the approach that they will be taking with regards to Donald Trump. Sadiq Khan has had very public differences with Donald Trump in the past. He's been critical of David Lammy's charm offensive in America. And we've seen it on other areas of foreign policy as well. David Lammy and the sort of Labour leadership have had this approach of acting like they're a government in waiting already. So they've very carefully tracked the US line on Israel and Gaza, for example, and that has had a sort of a small electoral impact in parts of the country. People upset about the line that Keir Starmer took in that LBC interview months ago. But just in general, there are lots of MPs who privately don't feel that comfortable with it. We've seen in the past how foreign policy can destroy Labour and government, and I think that's looking a bit likely this time.
Well, there are already problems here, of course. Dispute between Keir Starmer and Angela Rayner, the man who would like to be Prime Minister. The Labour leader is campaigning with his deputy. They are taking different positions on the future. You can see here Keir Starmer with Anna Sarwar, Labour's leader in Scotland. They're campaigning there this morning. They're taking different positions, Angela Rayner standing up there and Keir Starmer, over the future of veteran Labour politician Diane Abbott. Now, she was readmitted to the party after a long suspension for comments that she made about Jewish, Irish and traveller people not experiencing racism all of their lives. Keir Starmer has said she hasn't been barred from standing as a Labour candidate in the seat she's represented for a very long time. Diane Abbott says she has. Angela Rayner intervened yesterday to say that she should be allowed to stand. Alva, either way, how is this row looking to the public in terms of the way it has been handled and the impact on the election campaign?
So I think that most people within Labour would say that they don't think that this will change the polls, actually, even the people who are very upset about it, although it does seem that there's been a little bit of reporting today that it actually could be filtering through, because Diane Abbott is one of the most well-known politicians in the country.
That's what a lot of Labour
she
politicians...
just does, she's been in politics for decades. People do actually know her. So I think it is cutting through maybe a bit more than Labour politicians were expecting. But I actually think a factor that hasn't really been sort of taken into consideration as much is just the way this is filtering through to Labour members and activists. I think that, you know, it's not just people on the left of the party who feel like she hasn't been treated very fairly. And of course, Labour, even though they're miles ahead in the polls, they do need their volunteers to get out and knock doors. Like, that's the engine that will drive the campaign. And I think, you know, someone said to me yesterday that the people around Keir Starmer have forgotten that a Labour member is not necessarily particularly factional. They're a nice retired geography teacher who just cares about fairness. And if you alienate them and they feel like that Diane Abbott has been treated unfairly, they just won't turn out to campaign. We've already heard a bit of that in WhatsApp groups, members around the country.
Right.
MPs and candidates are worried that they're not going to have their activist teams coming out.
I mean, Meg Hillier, you're neighbouring, have been the MP for the neighbouring constituency. You probably know Diane extremely well. Should she be allowed to stand as a Labour candidate in this election?
Look, I mean, clearly she was let back into the Parliamentary Labour Party. She's been reselected by her members. And so normally there's just a rubber stamping at this point that would have happened much earlier. I think hopefully mine's gone through, where they rubber stamp our certificates of, I don't know what the exact word, I'll leave that to the NEC. It's just a process that has to be gone through. You obviously have to have processes in parties to make sure you're vetting candidates.
That's the process. But should she
she's now, because she was readmitted, she was the sitting Labour MP at the point the election was called. So it should be her call, because she was also gone through a process of reselection as well, just to reinforce that. And I think this is really unfortunate, the way this has been handled. But I could be clear, just it's a bit processy, but she can't just be barred by someone saying it to a newspaper, and she would have to have been informed and had a discussion. So she hasn't been barred, and I hope she's not, and I hope then she's given the dignity and opportunity to make her own choice. I mean, I've worked with her for, well, we were just discussing, it's over 24 years, about 24 years now since I was first elected to the London Assembly. She's been a great support to me personally. But I go around the world, or people come to visit here, and they all know who she is. You know, she has a reputation with, it's been the Caribbean, with South African ANC activists, all sorts of people who know who Diane Abbott is, and she's stood up and been a person who's pushed at the boundaries of political discourse for a long time and been a trailblazer for many people.
You'd like to see her stand as the Labour candidate?
If she wants to. I think, let's be clear, I'm not going to speak for Diane. I think, you know, would I do that? No. I mean, Diane could perfectly well speak for herself. If she wants to stand as a candidate, there should be nothing to stop her at this point, because she was readmitted as the Labour MP for Hackney South and Shoreditch. She was on the whip, if you like, at that point. And so it's a matter now for her to decide. So I wouldn't want to predict what Diane's going to say, because I wouldn't want to speak for her.
Right. I mean, Peter Kyle, who's a member of Labour's front bench, has said that Diane has got herself into this situation. Do you agree with him?
Well, I think her letter was unfortunate, but she did apologise very quickly. She's gone through a long process. The complaints process for some people has been very lengthy. It went on too long, left her in a very difficult position. But this briefing this week has been really unfortunate. It's been, I think, not fair to her. It's not treated her with any dignity, and it was completely inappropriate for someone to try and second guess what would actually ultimately, anyway, be an NEC decision and a process that would involve Diane. And for somebody to think that they could say that to a national newspaper journalist, I'm assuming that the briefing was correct, but I mean, I don't know. Right. I think was really inappropriate.
Well, Diane Abbott has said it's part of the party under Keir Starmer's leadership, carrying out a cull of left-wing candidates.
Can I say that when Jeremy Corbyn was in control, I had to go through in fact, the elections came in time, two very nasty attempts at deselection. All of us went through that, and the rules were changed, and to try and make it really difficult for people. And rules changed, even things like venues changing at short notice, all sorts of challenges thrown in our path in an attempt to get rid of people like me. I railed against that, and I made sure, and I got through the processes. But I think that I deplore really anything that sort of seems this factional in any team. I think you need to look at people on their merits.
Well, let's have a listen to Lloyd Russell Moyle, who has been the Labour MP for Brighton Kemp Town since 2017, when Jeremy Corbyn was leader of the Labour Party. Well, he was suspended as a candidate and stopped from standing by the party a few days ago after a complaint was made against him about his behaviour. I spoke to him a short while ago and said, well, what choice did the Labour Party have other than to suspend you and stop you from standing for the party because of the complaint?
Well, they could have made sure that they asked me to be able to put in a proper response. That wasn't even an option, and I had to force a response upon them from lawyers. They could have seen and checked the validity of the complainant, and could have allowed me to stand and then investigate me afterwards, like they will do with many complaints. There's no accusation that I'm a current danger to anyone. and a current danger to the campaign. These are historic issues around behaviour.
So you're saying that if you were a more important figure to the party leadership, they could have dealt with the complaint while still allowing you to stand as a candidate?
Well, of course, the rules state that there is a process. But we all know that the Labour Party would not have dealt with these complaints in this way if it was Keir or if it was a senior shadow cabinet member. It would have brought down the Labour Party, and they would have never have done that. So what's happened is I've been a sacrificial lamb because of that. Now, I want the best for the Labour Party. I want the Labour Party to form government, and I wanted to be part of that on youth policy, on housing policy, on the issues that I've been working on, and that I've got cross-party and in-party consensus on. And I think what has happened is a great shame. But what has exacerbated it is not then looking to find a local candidate that we know that we can transfer over to and work with, which has also added salt to the wounds. So I think it's a great shame, the process. And I do think it raises wider questions about how the Labour Party operates. It is one system if you are very at the top or in the clique, and it is another system if you're not. And now that's not the fault of individuals, that's the fault of the system. It's the fault of the system that we allow NEC members to suddenly be parachuted into positions at the last moment when they're the judge and jury. And we mustn't allow that kind of potential for cronyism to happen. And so what we need is a proper process that understands the politics of it, because you can't have an independent process that doesn't understand the politics.
Meanwhile, a very close ally of Keir Starmer, Chris Ward, has been selected for the seat you were hoping to represent. Diane Abbott has described left-wing candidates being blocked and allies of Starmer being parachuted in as a cull. Is she right?
I think it would be better if the party made sure that when they are replacing MPs at the last minute, they replace them with MPs that are similar in terms of ideological belief or from local roots. And I think that then those accusations wouldn't be able to be made. Unfortunately, they're not doing that.
So is there a cull of left-wing candidates like you?
Well, quite clearly, the timing for me is highly suspicious. The reappointment of the person who's replacing me is highly suspicious. And it does mean that those are accusations that anyone would end up making.
Should Diane Abbott be allowed to stand as a Labour candidate in this election?
I always agree with Angela Rayner. I think she should.
Meg, what's your response listening to that?
Well, I really feel for Lloyd, and I think one of the challenges of the complaints processes that now are swirling around all our parties, actually, and in Parliament, is that last-minute accusations can be made. And this is something that a lot of MPs worry. Now, I think, as Lloyd said there, if, you know, there are these needs. He's not saying it didn't need to be looked at.
But are you saying one rule for those in the clique at the top, shadow cabinet, and another for him?
And
he's viewed as a left winger.
What happened in Redbridge at the point of a selection there? Jazz Atwell had now the candidate actually for that first one of the Ilford seats. And an allegation was made about him, so he was taken off the panel for the party selection at that point. So we've seen this sort of thing happen before. And I think that where Lloyd makes a really sensible point is, and I've said this elsewhere, that when you have a new process like this, you need to look at it and review it and make sure that it's working and is fit for purpose. Now, that doesn't help Lloyd, but it does mean that I think we need to make sure that it is fair and seen to be fair and people trust it.
But does it look like a conspiracy? I will come to you, Mel, in just a moment. Does it look like a conspiracy? I mean, Meg is right that when Jeremy Corbyn was leader, there were attempts, they weren't successful, I don't think, there were attempts to deselect candidates on the other wing of the party.
Yes, definitely. I mean, this is a sort of hallowed Labour tradition, but I think it is the case that Starmer has gone further than Corbyn did, even though that did happen under Corbyn. I think the only thing is that the Tories do also plan to do this in the coming days. So I think we could see some people working in Number 10.
Well, they're desperately scrabbling around for candidates, aren't they? I mean, but how does it look to the public? How does it look to you, Jo? Is this a party that is focusing on discipline? They've set a very high bar. It's a changed Labour Party. That's what Keir Starmer wants to project, and they want their candidates to be of the highest standards.
But I think that's the challenge. So Lloyd's obviously got a particular situation, but to sort of complain about the process just because you're then subject to it is sort of you know, it's a bit like Trump. It's kind of, you know, complaining about it after the event. The reality is the Labour Party are saying that they want whistleblowers and in public life. They want in public services, they're saying they want people to be able to speak up. So actually, if someone did have a genuine concern about a potential candidate, they should have the right to report it. We don't know enough about the allegations to know what, you know, the merit of them. So that is the first point. The second is, I think the problem that Keir Starmer's got, which I think is a bit of a shame actually, he's trying to show that he's taking control and, you know, I'm a Prime Minister in waiting, but then they've sort of bungled it along the way because of the way this week's gone. So then they've had a situation where you've got, you know, we've sort of done something, was there a deal, wasn't there a deal, and sort of restoring the whip, but then suddenly Diane is or isn't, you know, this sort of, I suppose, split at the top of the party, but then also this NEC thing that's still happening a few days away. So they've sort of caused a bit of misery for themselves. And I think for Keir, some people out there will actually say, no, it's right, it's good he's taking control. We want to see someone who will take action. We've had a Prime Minister that it's been perceived, and previous Prime Ministers who haven't taken action about candidates where there have been issues and where there's been a lack of discipline or things have been done wrong. So I think it's a real unfortunate situation because Keir could have looked very much in control, very much in charge, and instead I think it's sort of a bit of a wound for him, which is a shame.
I think that this leak to the Times was very deeply unfortunate, but I do agree that you need a process, and we've had some pretty bad MPs elected and gone to prison and things.
Does it really matter, Mel? Because there's yet another person, someone who was standing as a Conservative candidate up until about 24 hours ago, Mark Logan, who has said he's no longer going to stand as a Conservative candidate. Hang on, he is going to back Labour. In fact, he's embracing the feeling of 1997 when Tony Blair was swept on a landslide. Just before I come to you, let's have a listen to what he had to say.
The time has come to bring back optimism into British public life and within my constituents in Bolton North East. And I think for too long there's been a kind of sense of negativity, there's been a sense of decline, and over a long period of time I've just felt that when I look back to my teenage years in 1997, whenever Labour came to the fore at that time, and we obviously heard the song Things Can Only Get Better, I feel that we're at that point again in British politics and British history, and that's why that I've decided that I'll be going for Labour at this next election on the 4th of July.
Mel?
So, look, it's always sad when a colleague moves as Mark has done. But actually, if you look at the letter that he published at the time he took his decision to make this move, there was not a single Labour policy or aspiration or anything specific in that rather lengthy letter. Yes, it does, because it goes to the heart of what this general election campaign is all about. So we've come through a really tough time as a country through COVID and recovering from that, high inflation being imported from a war overseas and so on. And we're coming out the other side. We're seeing the highest level of growth in the last quarter of the G7.
Well, it hasn't
inflation
convinced
having
him,
come down.
It hasn't convinced him, and it hasn't convinced Dan Poulter,
the choice is very
Natalie
simple.
Elphick. They crossed the floor of the House to go to the Conservatives, and Lucy Allen, who's standing down, wants reform.
Either we have a very clear plan that continues to make the progress and give us security going forward, or we have no plan with Keir Starmer. And can I just, on Diane Abbott, because I was very patient listening to the conversation earlier, let me just make a point. I think what we're overlooking here is what it actually says more about is Keir Starmer and less about is Diane Abbott. And what I mean by that is that I think Keir Starmer is somebody who supports people when it suits him and it's useful and then drops it when it doesn't. You can go back to Jeremy Corbyn. He supported him twice to be our Prime Minister with all his very strong left-wing views. He at the time was supporting Diane Abbott to be our Home Secretary. When he ran for leadership, he wanted to support students with abolition of tuition fees, which you turned on, and now it doesn't suit him. Or in fact, he's not quite sure because he's now being pushed and shoved by Angela Rayner as to where he is on...
There's plenty of Conservatives over the last 5 Prime Ministers who have served with people that they didn't necessarily back for the leadership of the Conservative Party and Prime Minister. Well, it's been a pattern for some of your colleagues too, and I think, but there is a responsibility. When we were actually quite a small party, about half of our PLP, Parliamentary Labour Party, had to be on the front bench because you've got to populate those positions. And if people withdraw, you've got to have somebody doing the job of opposition. And there is a proper job of opposition in terms of policy. Look, we're inheriting a huge mess from the Conservatives. Liz Truss's short reign has thrown the country into chaos. And all of that, it means that whatever we would have wanted to do 4 or 5 years ago, we are having to trim according to the cloth that we're going to have available if we win the election.
And do you think there are going to be more people deciding that they're going to back Labour rather than the Conservatives? I mean, we have had this string of defections, and actually I was mentioning Lucy Allen, who is standing down and is promoting reform and was suspended as a result. I mean, Does it look like they're leaving a sinking ship? Is that the impression that you're left with, Jo?
Well, I think that was the accusation from quite a lot of MPs that decided to stand down and not even fight the election. When you saw how many were leaving politics altogether, it was clear that there was a sort of sense of what's coming next. Have I got the appetite for it? And there were people that thought perhaps they were just going to go and try and get other jobs before there was a mass exodus, if the polls are to be believed. So I think there is still time for more to switch. I think there are MPs that are unhappy. Many are still very unhappy about just even the way the election's been called, and sort of the way that some of their colleagues have left politics, not having that sort of moment to say goodbye properly, to finish tying up loose ends. There's always that fractious sort of period, and I think that hasn't helped for sort of unity. And I'm sure quite a lot of activists are just quite worn out after just having done the local elections and are not relishing the fact that they've had to go back into another election campaign. They're probably all quite worn out.
I think what's interesting is that Mark Logan, like Natalie Elphicke, doesn't really stand to gain from this defection on the face of it, because he isn't planning to stand again in Bolton North East. I think it's worth throwing into the mix there that Labour does need to appoint a lot of lords to get its legislation through in the next government. I think it might be worth... I have no prior knowledge on that, but I know that Sue Gray is looking at who will be getting peerages. They'll need to appoint hundreds, probably.
And public appointments. And there's chairs of things that will need to be appointed as well.
I think that's an interesting thing.
I mean, one thing to sort of finish off, because there was a YouGov poll done in The Times on some of the policies that been announced by the Conservatives and Rishi Sunak, including national service, including what we call the pensioner triple lock, and actually there seems to be significant support for them. Yeah. But it's not moving the dial nationally. They seem to sort of like some of the policies that you come out with, but they don't like you. Not you, personally. But,
I'm coming on regularly because people do like me.
Oh, I see, that's it.
Come on, you haven't got it. Yeah, look, we are undoubtedly behind in the polls.
Yes.
The poll that matters, of course, is the general election. There is 4 weeks still to go. There are a lot of undecided voters out there. And what we know is that we are putting, as you say, popular and bold and clear policies forward.
Well, I'm not saying it, but that's what the polling seems to suggest.
Well, that's what people are saying,
yes.
Whereas Labour, we just don't know.
Well, I mean, look,
Well,
you're talking about going back to the 1950s, all of these policies, I mean, sort of national service and so on. That's not a vision for a modern Britain. Whereas when you see our manifesto, you'll see a bit more.
It's very popular in Sweden. 80% of those that go through it.
Well, I'm not sure that our cyber issues in the army are going to be solved by 18-year-olds being recruited for a year. And if that's your plan,
it'll
I'm really worried about
set them up for a better life and learning lots of things.
Well, rather a lot of your backbenchers are very against it and certainly not going to be campaigning for it.
All right, well, we're going to catch up with the campaign in Scotland, and particularly the campaign from the SNP. You'll remember, of course, John Swinney, the SNP First Minister in Scotland. Well, he's only been in the job a short while, a few weeks, and now been thrust into an election campaign, and he's been campaigning on the issue of the economy. But let's talk to Drew Hendry, SNP MP, and actually, no longer MP, of course. Drew, we have given everyone the opportunity when they first appear to give a 30-second pitch for your party. And Richard Thompson was on last week, and I forgot. So, Drew, it's over to you to do the 30-second pitch for the SNP.
Well, I think that the SNP want to stand up for values in Scotland. We want to eliminate child poverty. We already have the Scottish Child Payment, which has lifted 100,000 children out of poverty. We want to see real movement on the just transition, one that protects jobs and makes sure that we can tackle climate change and keep the good work we've got on that going. And of course, we want to make sure that we grow the economy in Scotland and continue to do the good work in terms of having the highest growth per person in the UK.
All right.
So all of those things are things that we want to continue to do.
Oh, well done to you. You almost stopped in time for the 30 seconds. I'm sure you've given a warm welcome to Keir Starmer too, the Labour leader, because he's been campaigning in Scotland and talking about his plan for a publicly owned energy company, Great British Energy, launching with a headquarters in Scotland. He says it'll bring a huge number of skilled jobs to Scotland and drive the transition to clean energy. What's not to like, Drew?
Well, first of all, I don't think it's clear what it is, because he's been on the BBC this morning, unlike Anna Sarwar, who said this was going to be an energy generating company, saying that it's not, in fact, an energy company. It's an investment vehicle, and that investment vehicle will be targeting private investment. So it sounds a bit like something that's been tried before. You remember the Green Energy Bank, which was sold off to private interests. So, you know, maybe he's trying a bit of recycling here, but it doesn't sound like what he's been putting forward as an energy company.
Well, let's see if Meg Hillier knows. Do you want to illuminate?
Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, it's going to. I think the aim is that it will. I mean, may well be doing some private investment. But look, I agree with him on the Green Investment Bank. That was axed, and the government actually introduced an infrastructure bank kind of instead. So we've been through that before. So Labour will want to see the production of this in you know, owned partly by the people. Look, I'm a Labour co-op MP. I'd like to see some of this as cooperatively owned by those who can benefit from it. I've seen some great green co-ops around the country. It's kind of, I mean, I'm trying to explain in very short order. It's difficult to go into all the detail, but that, you know, there is an ambition to do that. But look, I know that there's an awful lot of private money willing and keen to invest in green energy. We need to make sure we get this off the ground to get people off the hook of being reliant on the high cost of energy provided, as we've seen with the war in Ukraine, you know, from elsewhere. So it's making us self-reliant and therefore reducing bills.
Well,
and they're the really two key messages about this. And, you know, it'll take a while to ramp up to that, but when it does, that will be a huge benefit to the British public.
Drew?
Well, of course, what we needed was what the Labour Party originally promised and what their advisor said was absolutely needed for the UK, which was a £28 billion a year investment in the just transition. But of course, there was a massive U-turn on a big betrayal of that promise, and that was what was required. Well, look, and what we have now is money being taken away in the, you know, to propose that to be used for nuclear power stations in England from Scotland.
Let Meg respond.
It's going to risk jobs rather than create them. 100,000 jobs could go, according to the independent research.
Drew, I spent 9 years chairing the Public Accounts Committee in the UK Parliament, and you know, I know how to look at funding energy. That 28 billion a year was right. You couldn't have spent it actually in that first year, so it was right to revisit that, because you could spend it but not well. You need a plan for what you want to get out of it and then match the money to it. And it's quite right that Rachel Reeves is saying we need to trim what we spend according to what's available, and so making sure that we get the outcomes and we make sure that the money follows to deliver those outcomes. But just setting up an arbitrary figure was something that, you know, ambition at the time, but when you actually start looking at the books, you realise that it's a better way of doing that. And so I was really actually quite pleased when we dropped that, because I think it was much more realistic and honest. And this government has promised lots on green energy and not delivered at all.
Drew, can I just interject here? I'm going to show our viewers this headline in The Guardian. It's from 2017. Nicola Sturgeon, former First Minister, proposes cheap state-owned energy for Scotland. Well, isn't that what you were offering then? Why are you disagreeing with it now?
Well, of course, you know, we have looked at that and it was seen to be not possible to take forward at the time. So, you know, the fact that the Labour Party are proposing something very similar just now, you know, in fact, not very similar, because they're not proposing to do any energy generation.
Well, hang on, is it similar? Is it similar or isn't it similar?
Well, clearly it's not, because Sir Keir Starmer has said this morning that it's an investment vehicle and not an energy producing you know, entity at all. And what we have here is quite simply just another being wedded to austerity like the Tories from the Labour Party, a failure to invest. That we're going to see. They already know, the Institute for Fiscal Studies have pointed out in unprotected public services that there is at least a £19 billion black hole that they've said there's a conspiracy of silence over filling, which is going to affect public services. So they're going to continue with austerity. They're not going to invest in the just transition. They're going to keep things like the two-child cap.
All right, well, let Meg respond, because if you made the accusation that Labour are going to continue austerity, as you characterise it, Meg,
they're following the fiscal rules.
Is that what you're doing?
Money doesn't grow.
The same fiscal rules.
But Drew, money doesn't grow on trees. I mean, Rachel Reeves has a clear plan to grow the economy and make sure that we get income in that way. But look, we can't promise what we can't deliver. I'm very clear. I've spent nearly over a decade on the Public Accounts Committee looking at failures of government delivery. So it's really important that we have plans in place to make sure that what we promise the electorate is deliverable. We can all promise the earth, but we need to make sure we're actually delivering. And the British public are not fools. They know a cheap political promise when they see it, and we're trying to avoid that and make sure that we're promising what is actually deliverable. And it doesn't really matter who owns the energy, particularly. I mean, we can go into all of that, but the point is it's owned by the public. Or the public will have a say in it and own the companies that are responsible for it, even if they're not the ones that are actually doing the generation, because we might be bringing in all sorts of bits of the system that might want to be part of Great British Energy. There's lots of potential for this. We'll start with the early days and see where it goes.
Well, Mel Stride, do you like the idea of GB Energy?
No, I don't. And one
Why
of the things
not?
I don't like is that you can't promise things that you can't deliver, Meg. That's the whole point. So what we know is that Labour have come forward with £38.5 billion of unfunded net spending.
Well, you come up with 71 billion.
No, well, I'll deal with that in a second if you'd like. But there is a difference between these apparent black holes, and the difference is that the Treasury, the official Treasury figures have underpinned this figure of £38.5 billion. Now, what Labour have done is they've ruled out increases in some of the big taxes, like
my question was about
and
GB Energy. Why don't you like it?
Because it adds to this £38.5 billion
They
of
say it's going to
unfunded
reduce
promises.
bills.
Well, it may or may not. I doubt it very much.
You think it might?
But I said it may or may not.
green
But my
energy is
point
getting
is,
cheaper.
my point is, Jo,
Yes.
that you've got £38.5 billion of unfunded tax cuts. You've got a Labour Party that's been pushed into a position where it's ruled out raising the 4 largest tax raises in the UK tax system. The question now is, what are they going to be taxing in order to pay for that? Because otherwise the sums don't add up.
Yes, I mean, I don't want to hang on. I don't want to press the point about you saying yes, you can only promise what you can deliver.
Yeah.
You know, you promised to stop the boats. You promised to bring down levels of net migration. You promised to reduce taxes. Yes, you've made these cuts to national insurance, but
I thought we
generally,
were talking about GB energy
but you just made yes, well, that was my initial question. But you went on to the broader economy in terms of what is promised, and actually you've mentioned tax rises or spending cuts, which is what the Institute for Fiscal Studies said. Drew Hendry, I'm interested, this emergency budget that the First Minister is suggesting, he wants an emergency budget within days, I think, of the election result, Keir Starmer or Rishi Sunak. So why? Why an emergency budget then?
Well, because we can't go on with the austerity that we've had for the past 14 years. It's ground things down for people. It's caused untold misery and difficulty with household budgets, and the Labour Party are proposing almost exactly the same, following the same fiscal rules.
You would like to see tax rises, an emergency budget with tax rises
we would like to see an emergency budget that looks to invest in public services so that you can grow the economy in the way that needs to be done. Look, it's madness to continue with austerity and continue to think that you can get a different result by imposing austerity, whether it's Tory-led austerity or Labour austerity. It's just madness to continue with that. The UK needs increased productivity. It needs proper growth, and you cannot do that without investment. And that's the problem with both of their plans. They're not looking.
I'll come back. We've only got a few minutes left. You're shaking your head, Jo.
Well, I think the point is the investment point is exactly what Labour are proposing. They're saying, and you know, there have been reports written about how, you know, the system puts off investment, and actually what they're saying is we're actually going to take a punt. We're going to take a punt on different types of energy. We're going to back it. We're going to see if it'll work. It's risky, but it's bold. So at least they're trying to do something. But the idea of an emergency budget, I mean, you know, great idea. But at least, you know, if you move into a house, you don't arrange for the builders or the electricians to turn up on day one to go and fix stuff. You don't even know what's there. Give them a chance to get in and find out what's going on.
Right.
But you need to be realistic. It would be a
stupid,
stupid, pointless budget that wouldn't deliver anything if you're doing it that early. You've got to give people time to get into the figures and work out what the plans are.
And can I be clear, Rachel Reeves isn't about gimmick budgets. She wants to do a proper budget, and then you've got to have a spending review, which is where the real impact of what money will be spent in every sector will come through. And she's not reckless. She's a responsible Shadow Chancellor. Hopefully will be the Chancellor of the Exchequer. And in doing it fast doesn't necessarily mean it's very good.
Hang on, don't. I just want to get Alvin before the end of the programme. The idea of an emergency budget might remind people of Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng when they had their emergency mini budget that wasn't looked over by the Office for Budget Responsibility and so on. Hang on, Drew. I'm just going to get Alvin and then I'll come back to you.
I mean, we saw how badly that went. I mean, from reporting on that after the time, I think working in secret on budgets over the summer is a bad idea. It doesn't really work. But Drew's actually completely right on the substantive issue that there is a conspiracy of silence between the two parties on this. Whoever wins the next election will have to put up taxes, and no one's really being honest about it.
Drew, you've got 10 seconds to count us out the programme.
Well, look, we've got to find out the impact on public services from that £19 billion black hole has to be addressed. Otherwise, people are going to suffer more. That's why we need an emergency budget.
Drew Hendry, thank you very much. And thank you to all of my guests. Have a great afternoon. Bye.